Almost 1 year ago to the day, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia announced the creation of the AUKUS military pact. This pact is a dangerous, transparently imperialistic, and anti-communist act aimed at the People's Republic of China. The Communist Party USA, as well as our fraternal parties, the Communist Party of Britain and the Communist Party of Australia, condemn this irresponsible provocation by the forces of imperialism. To speak more in depth about this topic, we have our next speaker, Dr. Hannah Middleton. Dr. Hannah Middleton has been active in the peace movement since a teenager, first in England and later in Australia. Hannah participated in the annual Aldermaston to London 4-day peace marches from 1958 to 1965 and the Committee of 100 civil disobedience campaigns. Later in Australia, she was a founding member of the Australian Anti-Basis Campaign Coalition. Committed to nonviolent direct action for peace and social justice, she was arrested during several protest actions at the US warfighting and spy bases in Australia. She has been active in campaigns against the arms trade and against US-Australia war games, as well as working with groups in the Philippines, Guam, South Korea, Japan, Fiji, and Kanaki, as well as the US and the UK. Most recently, she is active in the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network and in the Sydney Anti-Orcus campaign. In 1972, Hannah was awarded a PhD for her thesis on the Aboriginal land rights campaign, and since then, she has maintained her solidarity with the Indigenous struggle for land and human rights. From 2009 to 2013, Dr. Middleton was General Secretary of the Communist Party of Australia, having been CPA president for many years before that. We are proud to host such a devoted and esteemed comrade. Comrade Middleton, you have the floor.
Thank you, Comrade Chair. Comrades, on behalf of the Communist Party of Australia, I'd like to thank the Communist Party of the United States for this really important initiative and for inviting us to contribute to the conference. And on behalf of my party, I send our fraternal greetings and solidarity to all your members and your supporters. I acknowledge that I am speaking from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora community. I pay my respects and the respects of the comrades and supporters in Australia. My respects to Indigenous elders, past and present, and I acknowledge that this is Aboriginal land, always was, always will be. Comrades, on the 16th of September last year, the former Morrison government suddenly announced the formation of what was called an enhanced trilateral security partnership between the US, the UK, and Australia, now known as AUKUS. AUKUS is fundamentally about US imperialism wanting to use Australia as a base to confront and, if and when the time comes, to attack China. For the US ruling class, it is better to set Australia up as a primary target than Hawaii or the west coast of the US. The abrupt cancellation of the existing $90 billion contract for French diesel submarines cost millions of dollars in compensation and ruptured Australian-French relations for over 18 months. The major component of AUKUS is Australia's agreement to purchase 8 nuclear-powered submarines. The first one will not be operational until 2040, and the last by 2060. By then, of course, the submarines will be obsolete, they will be death traps, susceptible to detection and destruction by existing and new technologies. A former Australian diplomat, Bruce Haig, has suggested, quote, "The submarine deal was always a smokescreen to get US nuclear-armed submarines based in Australia. The so-called deal was a sop to public opinion, and for the moment, it has worked." Former Prime Minister Morrison claimed that under AUKUS, Australia is not seeking to establish nuclear weapons or establish a civil nuclear capability. These claims were immediately undercut when the Minerals Council of Australia and leading members of his own government called for a domestic nuclear industry to help develop the skills needed to maintain and operate a nuclear-powered submarine fleet. Others in the peace movement and wider are concerned that the AUKUS partnership will rekindle Australian efforts made in the 1960s to acquire nuclear weapons, a debate which is now underway in Australian strategic think tanks. However, the US military bases at Pine Gap outside Alice Springs in the center of Australia, Shoal Bay near Darwin, the major city in the north of Australia, and Geraldton and Northwest Cape in Western Australia are far more important to the United States than a few extra submarines. Australia hosts around 50 United States bases, including training, live firing ranges, logistics and materiel, intelligence, surveillance, communications, and troop bases. In addition, all Australian Army, Navy, and Air Force bases are open for use by the US military at a moment's notice. There are few other electronic surveillance installations in the world that produce anything near this quantity of intelligence on China's military communications and radar signals, as well as political, economic, and scientific communications. But AUKUS is not just about nuclear-powered submarines. Under AUKUS, Australia will be further militarized and garrisons, with more deployments of US aircraft in Australia, more US surface and subsurface vessels in Australia, more joint war games, 4 new military bases, 2 new bases for the militarization of space, greater cooperation in hypersonic weapons, cyber warfare, underwater systems, artificial intelligence, and long-range strike capabilities, including Tomahawk long-range cruise missiles, and also support for combined military operations in our region. Oh, my apologies. Before AUKUS, the United States had been militarizing the north of Australia as a potential site to threaten China. The US military colonization of Australia's north was accelerated in September last year at the 31st Australia-United States ministerial consultation. This meeting takes place annually, and on this occasion endorsed the following military cooperation: deployment of US aircraft in Australia and aircraft training and exercises, increasing US surface and subsurface vessels in Australia, more exercises and greater combined engagement with allies in the region. The September agreement represents a total subordination of Australia's interests to those of US imperialism. It licenses the deployment of nuclear weapons into Australia, potentially including long-range nuclear-armed bombers, ballistic missile submarines, and tactical nuclear cruise missiles. The agreement is one of a series of many recent developments that are tying Australia to US plans for retaining its regional military dominance in the face of China's rise. They include significant and extremely costly upgrades at air bases at Tyndall and Darwin, to extend runways and upgrade fuel storage facilities to accommodate US long-range bombers, as well as upgrades to training ranges and aviation facilities used by Australian and US forces, particularly the 2,500 strong US Marine Air Ground Task Force, which is on permanent rotation through Darwin, a major city in the north. These developments strongly indicate that the Australian continent will serve as a substantial base for projecting power against China, particularly US power, but also Australian power in a US-led war. The enormity of these concessions and the abrogation of sovereign responsibility for the security of the Australian people are supported by the new Labor Party government, which is firmly locked into imperialism and defense of the capitalist system at any cost, particularly a cost to our people. In May this year, the right-wing, lying, corrupt Morrison government was finally thrown out, and the Social Democrat Australian Labor Party, the ALP, won power, except, thank goodness, in the upper house, our Senate, where Greens and independents hold the balance of power. The new Labour Defence Minister, Miles, has gone so far as to say that Australia is not only working interoperatively with the US military in numerous ways, but that we are now committed to integration of the Australian Defence Force into US force structures. Our new Prime Minister Albanese has said, quote, "We will deepen our regional defence cooperation with close partners, including Japan, India, Singapore, and others, to bolster our joint capabilities, shape our strategic environment, and uphold the rules of the road." That, of course, is imperialist spin for encircle, contain, and defeat socialist China. The new Australian Labor government has adopted the role of preeminent attack dog of US imperialism in the Asia-Pacific region. It has joined with the Biden administration in ratcheting up the confrontation with China, which was escalated recently by the highly provocative visit of US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan. Australian governments are ignoring history and refusing to acknowledge that Western imperialist domination of our region is ending. This geopolitical shift is characterized by, among other things, changes in trade. In 2000, over 80% of the world's countries traded more with the US than China. By 2020, 70% of the world countries had more trade with China. As a result, there is a threat that Australia may get involved in a conflict that the US and its allies cannot possibly win, and from which we in Australia cannot possibly benefit, whatever happens. For Australia to squander $170 billion on these submarines is unforgivable. In addition, Australia paid $835 million to French shipbuilder Naval Group and $35 million to US defense contractor Lockheed Martin in compensation for the cancelled French submarine contract. AUKUS also smacks of lining US arms corporations' pockets at Australian taxpayers' expense. The US has a history of foisting rubbish on the Australian Defence Force, such as the F-35, colloquially known as the Flying Turds. There are better ways of allocating this extraordinary spending: regional cooperation, diplomacy, massive fiscal repair, as well as health, housing, education, and above all, environmental repair. The adoption of a peace budget will create far more jobs and far greater security for the Australian people. US imperialism's current approach of encircling and containing China includes the formation of the Quad, AUKUS, Five Eyes, and other strategic military alliances. Your President Joe Biden signed the National Defense Authorization Act in December last year. This calls for an unbroken chain of US armed sentinel states stretching from Japan, India, and South Korea to Australia, Thailand, the Philippines, and Singapore to encircle China. The narrative built to hide US fear of China as a rival power, challenging US imperialism's regional hegemony, is that China is an authoritarian state that is a military threat. However, there clearly has been no pattern of China moving outside its boundaries, other than in respect of territories such as islands, which it has always insisted were its own. The war of words and most of the actions were consciously provoked by Australia. When China barred some imports from Australia, the US did not hesitate to fill the gap. Today, US imperialism is fighting to maintain its domination of the Pacific, pouring millions of dollars into so-called aid, funding the Peace Corps' return to our region, establishing new enemies across the Pacific, and appointing the first US envoy to the Pacific Islands Forum. But any hope that Australia's island neighbours will welcome further nuclearization of the region is ridiculous. Within days of the AUKUS announcement, a series of statements from Pacific leaders, community elders, and media organizations highlighted the persistence of the deep anti-nuclear sentiment across the region. Pacific communities are calling for an alternative future that replaces militarized security with genuine human security. Fiji Prime Minister Bainimarama stressed that, quote, the commitment of the Pacific Island nations to the elimination of nuclear weapons is not based on an abstraction. It is based on real experiences with the consequences of nuclear fallout, and it is at the root of our sense of urgency. Solomon Islands Prime Minister Sogavare said that his nation, quote, would like to keep our region nuclear free and put the region's nuclear legacy behind us. We do not support any form of militarization in our region that could threaten regional and international peace and stability. And Marshall Islands President David Kabua stated, quote, "We tirelessly underscore that no people or nation should ever have to bear a burden such as ours, and that no effort should be spared to move towards a world free of nuclear weapons and nuclear risk." After World War II, the US was so far in the lead that it could establish and run the global order. The US gave the orders. Gradually, however, industrial powers recovered and decolonization and the non-aligned movement grew. US imperialism responded by beating all this back violently, using wars, assassinations, overturning governments, and more. With Asia now the center of global economic power, imperialism is working to retain its economic and political primacy, risking war and even nuclear Armageddon. This madness has its origin in the United States, whose ruling class is greatly threatened by the advances of the Chinese people, which pose an existential threat to the advantages long enjoyed by Western corporations, which have benefited from centuries of colonialism. The aim of US imperialism's foreign policy is to prevent any national power becoming a challenge to the US. The US has defined China as its principal threat and is now working to instigate a war between Taiwan and China. And Australia is playing a major role in this. Immediately after the announcement in September last year, Anti-Orcus groups sprang up around Australia, and a national organisation is emerging, the Australian Anti-Orcus Coalition. There have been many protest rallies, leaflet distributions, social media campaigns, and more. Our party worked hard to bring trade unions into this growing movement. The National Coalition has raised $17,000 for an advertisement in a national newspaper to appear on the first anniversary of the announcement of AUKUS. Meanwhile, a petition already has 26,000 signatures. Our party reached out to our fraternal parties in the US and the UK, and also participated in international peace movement forums. We gave particular attention to the development of resistance among Asian and Pacific states. However, this initial flurry of intense discussion and actions diminished as the conflict in Ukraine dominated our attention. It is essential that it is reactivated. Recognizing that war is the product of the anarchic and competitive character of the capitalist world order, we do know that in order to attend bloody imperialist wars, we must overthrow capitalism. This is an urgent task, for as a declining imperial empire struggles viciously to retain its domination, we face a fight that can possibly end in the common rule of the contending classes. In this situation, we must confront it on a global scale. We must build the widest and strongest peace movement possible to win reforms that can help save the planet and also contribute to the fight to replace capitalism by socialism. We have to argue that countries buying more and more deadly weapon systems in an escalating arms race does not create peace or security. It has not worked in the past, and it never will. Human security is not based on escalating military spending and war games, but on care for the planet and its inhabitants, a state which is impossible under capitalism. It is time for us to insist that governments around the world redirect their massive war spending to serve humanity suffering from lack of food, water, and other human needs amid an expanding climate catastrophe. Thank you, comrades.
Up next, we will give the floor to Comrade Liz Payne, Chair of the Peace Commission of the Communist Party of Britain. And then following that, we will have a Q&A and panel session as well. Comrade Liz Payne was until the Communist Party of Britain's Congress last November, its national chair, a position she held for 7 years. Since standing down, Liz has continued to work extensively with the party's International Commission and is leading its work on peace, including the reestablishment of its Peace Commission. She also continues to chair the Southwest England and Cornwall district of the party. Liz is convener of the British Peace Assembly, Britain's only affiliate of the World Peace Council. Liz has represented the party, British Peace Assembly, and National Assembly of Women, on whose executive she sits, at a number of international meetings, seminars, and congresses across the world. Liz is a lifelong trade unionist, international solidarity campaigner, and regular writer for progressive papers and magazines on themes of peace, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and in the defense of human and democratic rights. Comrade Payne, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Can I also begin by thanking the Communist Party of the USA International Department and Peace and Solidarity Commission for this incredible initiative. And it is so needed at this time, at this serious time in international relations, when the actual future of the planet and all its peoples is in jeopardy. I'd like to open by saying that at our Congress, which you have just mentioned, when the General Secretary gave his opening remarks, Comrade Robert Griffiths said this, that war and preparation for war propel the doomsday clock towards midnight. The drive to domination and the drive to war go hand in hand. And the targets for imperialism are Russia, and of course, the major target is China. But the US, Britain, France, Japan, and Australia, and many more countries are increasing their military budgets. But in Britain, hundreds of billions and almost doubling of our nuclear arsenal could be invested in public services, in the creation of jobs, and in socially useful production. But conservatives, whoever they are, they represent the interests of the ruling classes, and they vehemently oppose socialism and communism. The imperialists are doing everything possible to counter China's rise, undermining the unity of China in respect of Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, Inner Mongolia. But there is an ideological crusade, anti-communism, xenophobia, and this is producing anti-Asian racism in Britain, which is fueling, of course, the fascism, which steps into the vacuum which the failure of social democratic policies and neoliberal policies has created. And AUKUS, expanding the development of nuclear and cyberspace armaments, is the most dangerous escalation of imperialist aggression in the Asia-Pacific region, as Comrade Hannah has just so comprehensively outlined. Opposition to AUKUS is an absolute imperative. It is the revival of the deliberately dangerous and provocative use of the unity between the US and the United Kingdom and all the forces that it can muster, and now making Australia the central point of this. The history of interoperability is very long. On the 18th of July in 1945, Churchill, in his first one-to-one meeting with Truman in Potsdam, talked about the interoperability, continuing the relationship that had been building up during the Second World War, the use of airfields and bases in British territories by the United States, the reciprocal arrangements between our two countries, and of course he wanted then an exclusive relationship with the United States. He said, why should not an American battleship calling at Gibraltar be able to get torpedoes to fit her tubes and the shells to fit her guns? We could add 50% to the mobility of the American fleet. And this, and the calling in of Australia, is a continuation of that, comrades. I want to turn to Britain's part in this. Security, Defence, Development and Foreign Policy Review, called Global Britain in a Competitive Age, March 2021, was described as the most radical reassessment of our place in the world since the Cold War. Britain is set to restore, replicate and future-proof an empire-like position. Britain will move, since COVID, will move from defending the international status quo to dynamically shaping a world order in which it, together with the United States, would sit at the heart of a network of like-minded countries and flexible groups. That is a quote. Active in Africa, the Middle East, and of course, the Indo-Pacific. The vision of global Britain is no mere nostalgic flight of fancy, but a potential reality that big business, the government and military are determined to create. Its realisation depends on Britain's capacity to draw on its deeply penetrating historical roots and burgeoning new relationships with governments of former colonies. And it is in this context that we should understand Britain's leading role in the voyage of the Carrier Strike Group, headed by the HMS Queen Elizabeth through the Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, South China Sea, and Sea of Japan and Western Pacific last year. The flotilla's itinerary might well have been titled Empire Revisited, as manoeuvres and interoperability exercises were undertaken with the armed services comrades of 40 countries, mostly former colonies. And Strike Group Commander Steve Morehouse described Britain's elation at being back out there. And the recently signed military pact, AUKUS, has to be seen in the light of global Britain. In presenting AUKUS to Parliament on the 16th of September, Boris Johnson's Empire speak was blatant, setting out in jingoistic terms the importance to Britain of the security of the Indo-Pacific, and referring to Australia, again in jingoistic terms, as a country joined to Britain by blood and history. This is what he said to Parliament. Britain, he proclaimed, would develop partnerships around the world, as well as continuing with historic ones, such as the Five Eyes, that's Malaysia, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain, oldest defence arrangement in the Pacific. And AUKUS would sit at the heart of this, comrades. So British help for Australia to acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. He said, "We shall place the UK's expertise in this field, amassed over decades, at the assistance of our Australian friends." And he described graphically what these submarines would do. They could circumnavigate the world without surfacing. Their stealth, they could go fast, they could keep a silent watch, this is a quote, over the vast expanses of the oceans, gathering intelligence, deterring adversaries, and guarding trade routes. And he said he had no problem with Australia getting this technology being introduced into the club that had this nuclear-powered technology because of the relationship, the historic relationship between Britain and Australia. And he said that Australia, the UK, and US will become inseparable partners in a project that will last for decades, as Comrade Hannah has very carefully explained. A project that would last for decades, creating opportunities for still greater defence. Carefully, he did not mention China, but it was absolutely obvious that that was the threat to which this was a response. But as well as thinking about what Britain is doing this against China and its development, we also need to look at what Britain itself is trying to do. Britain, in its global Britain in a competitive age, review and foreign policy setting that I have just spoken about, talks about being in partnership with Australia and the US, a new pillar of our strategy, demonstrating Britain's generational commitment to the security of the Indo-Pacific, and that it comes after, he said, the UK's success in becoming a dialogue partner of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. and Britain's application in February 2021 to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the free trade area with a 9 trillion GDP. So it is for control of that area for trade. It is to enhance the military industrial complexes of Britain. It is to subjugate the peoples of Southeast Asia, the Indo-Pacific region. By 2030, the Indo-Pacific will have global 40% of the global GDP. Johnson said on the 16th of September in Parliament last year that AUKUS won't stop with subs. We expect, he said, to accelerate the development of other advanced defence systems, including in cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and undersea capabilities. Of course, all the areas on which China is being painted as a rival, and of course, it is developing all technologies fast. It is, and the whole thing on the 16th of September, tragically, was welcomed by the Labour opposition in Parliament in Britain, welcomed by Keir Starmer, welcomed by a number of other Labour speakers. Boris Johnson added that day that the government's commitment to NATO was unshakable. He talked about the biggest uplift in defence spending since the Cold War. He talked about an 18-month scoping exercise for AUKUS to see where the job should go, where the deep pools of expertise lie, where the big companies of Britain could benefit from this. This was not the only debate on AUKUS, chilling as it was. He said that there are already structures in the region and AUKUS will add a new structure. And on the 21st of October, there was a debate on this, which was entitled "The Impact of AUKUS on Anglo-Chinese Relations," a very significant debate. And if you comrades want to read Hansard, you can read the full text of this, 21st of October, 2021. It was what is called a Westminster Hall debate. And it was very clear there that the members of Parliament perceived China as the embassy, as the enemy. 60% of global maritime trade goes through the South China Sea. China is taking control of this, they told each other. They talked about Britain's show of strength in the carrier strike group. They talked about Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong, Inner Mongolia. They accused China of genocide, of negatively impacting climate change. And one in the debate got up and talked about communism and said, "I know what communists are and what they are capable of." He said that China has a 1,000-year strategy to control global economies. They talked about religious persecution. They talked about China's intention to control Africa and its resources and infrastructure, all these accusations. And they said that they would describe AUKUS as historical allies, joining forces again, reinforcing their military bonds, tempered over the heat of many conflicts. The three countries have come together, he said, in the face of threat of Chinese hurtling towards us. And in all areas covered by the Pact, we've mentioned them in direct competition between China and the US. Britain is firmly behind the US, comrades. It is not, as some would say, a last-ditch attempt to assert itself around the globe. It is not a paper tiger. It is very serious. Comrades, Britain is armed and dangerous. It is in hoc with the United States, absolutely in hoc, and it is drawing Australia on the basis of empire and history into the web in which it is trying to play a major part. We have to resist it. Hannah is absolutely right when she said that we were beginning to liaise, to cooperate together and to challenge AUKUS in an internationalist and international manner, and that the war in Ukraine has to a certain extent put this on hold. Though of course in Britain we are very, very, very concerned to challenge AUKUS. But we must revive this. Since we had a new Prime Minister just at the beginning of this week, there has been a debate on AUKUS. What are we doing about AUKUS? That's Hansard for the 6th of September. Again, if any of you would like to look to see what was said. It is a living issue. Now, from the Communist Party's point of view, of course, the greatest thing that the Communist Party, our Communist Party and every Communist Party can do is in mobilizing the forces for peace in Britain, is to bring our understanding of the nature of the imperialist nature of the new Cold War, and that it must be halted. It's not jumping from conflict to conflict, asking for peace each time there's war. That will never do. The basis of imperialism and it is domination and aggression, and we have to explain that. We have to strengthen our relationship, a very good relationship with the International Meeting of Communist and Workers' Parties, with the parties of China, of Vietnam, of Cuba. We have to strengthen our relationships with the parties of other leading imperialist powers, the United States, and those who are suffering from the machinations of this imperialism. We have to work with the peace movement in Britain, with CND, with Stop the War, with the British Peace Assembly, and of course that is an affiliate of the World Peace Council, which we are completely in support of. We have a job to do within our party, because although we say all these things, they are not absolutely understood sometimes, even by our comrades, and we have to make sure that that is taken care of. In the trade union movement, as well as the peace movement, in the women's movement, in the community movements, wherever the working class comes together, they must understand that this is not in their interests, neither is it in the interests of any working class anywhere in the world. And we must come together in the true spirit of internationalism to save our people everywhere, to move towards socialism and ultimately communism, and to save our planet. And long live the proletarian internationalism, Communist Party of the United States, Communist Party of Australia, and all the communist parties of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Payne. We will now open the floor to questions. We will start with one from our live Zoom audience. The first question is for you, Dr. Middleton. This Zoom audience member wants to know, how has the Ukraine war impacted Australia and the Pacific region in general?
Right. Thank you, Comrade Chair. And would you please call me Hannah and not Dr. Middleton? We're amongst comrades. There is no doubt that the situation in the Ukraine has impacted the peace movement, particularly in Australia and of course elsewhere. The actual responsibility for the development of the conflict is not widely agreed in our peace movement, and there are divisions which have arisen which damage the strength of the peace movement. We've actually endeavored to the extent possible to try and focus on the two sort of main slogans of no nuclear submarines and no war with China, because we know we have at the moment 51% of the population who, when polled, say they do not want war with China. So we've got a small majority, which we think will build. But generally in Australia, the population have been persuaded that we must send military aid and we must accept Ukrainian refugees, and that Ukraine is a sort of poor, suffering country invaded by a brutal Putin. The media coverage is appalling. No alternative analysis of the situation is really available in the media, in academia, and by politicians. And so the majority of people are actually fed a series of emotional lies. There are very few public outlets which are not widely shared who try and present some alternative analysis. So the Ukraine has damaged, I think, the movement for peace in this country, and has certainly for some time distracted us from the campaign against China, which is in a sense more immediate for our peace movement. We're so close, we're being used as a sort of launching pad, and more militarized, and losing what sovereignty we had to US imperialism. So that development has been negative in that sense for the peace movement and for our contribution to world events, if you like. Thank you, Comrade Chair.
Thank you. We will now turn to a question from our live audience.
Hi. As AUKUS is rearing its head and the USA beats the war drum with Russia and a new Cold War is formed with China, it has become clear that supporting China is more important than ever. So how do we combat the anti-China propaganda in our nations, and what else can we do to support China?
Hannah and Liz, that is open for either who would like to answer.
Yes, if I could come on that, I would really like to underline that it is very, very important as a Communist Party to develop very, very close relations with the Communist Party of China and to listen very, very carefully to them and to their analysis, and to ensure that that percolates through our movement. The media barrage is absolutely incredible against China, and of course the whole of our working class, the conscious working class, as well as those who give very little thought to these things, are exposed to this. So I think it is extremely important to bring this understanding through our newspaper outlets. In Britain it would be through the Morning Star newspaper, of course, through our journals and any outlet such as that we have. That we convene, as we do, conferences and meetings where we invite people to participate and hear that. But you know, comrades and on the left, as well as the bigger population of Britain, they don't always just simply like to hear contradictions. We must make those contradictions. We must tell the truth. But we must also explain a way forward for peaceful relations. We must make sure that we don't confine our efforts to countering the lies, as important and focal as they are. To talk about how international relations can be, what great advances China is making, what a sharing of technologies and science and peaceful coexistence really means. And we must do everything we can in our countries to oppose our imperialist ruling class. We must oppose, in Britain, for example, global Britain policy. We must oppose British bases. We must oppose the jingoism at every turn, but always we must put forward the alternative very clearly. And we must, of course, focally influence the peace movement, because there is potential for a huge movement there. Thank you.